Thank you for joining us for our fourth episode of HeLPiNG Questions. I'm Dr. Alicia Luque, HeLPiNG Questions host. In today's episode, we will have the opportunity to ask Professor Jubin Abutalebi our fourth HeLPiNG question. Professor Jubin Abutalebi is a professor of neuropsychology and the director of the Center for Psychoneurolinguistics at the University Vita San Raffaele in Milano, Italy. Jubin's research on the cognitive neuroscience of bilingualism is groundbreaking and covers a wide range of topics that go from uncovering what are the brain and cognitive mechanisms that make bilingualism possible, to better understanding the consequences that being and becoming bilingual have for the mind and brain. Please take a seat and stay with us as we get to hear more from Jubin on what is unique about the bilingual brain. Welcome, Jubin, to the fourth episode of HeLPiNG Questions, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Hello, Alicia. Nice for having me with you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And the truth is, we're so excited to have you as our fourth guest and to be able to learn more about the bilingual brain, which, as you know, is definitely one of my favorite topics. And I know very well that is also the case for many of the people who have been following us and watching our previous episode of HeLPiNG Questions. Considering your groundbreaking work to help us better understand the cognitive neuroscience of bilingualism, we really couldn't think of a better person to ask our fourth HeLPiNG question. So thank you so much again for making the time to be with us. However, before we dive in with our HeLPiNG question, we thought we should set the stage by asking you two important questions that we believe are key to better understand the bilingual brain. How does that sound?
That sounds totally fine with me. Excellent.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, then the first question we would like to ask you to help us set the stage to our fourth HeLPiNG question, I think to best contextualize, right, what this means would be the following. Jubin, based on your experience, knowledge, and expertise, what would you say are the main contributions of neuroscience to the study of bilingualism?
Okay, Alicia. I mean, it's a very nice and important question, actually. And I could summarize it in one sentence, but then I'm going to explain it more in detail. Um, the the contribution of neuroscience to this field is actually where and how do things happen in the human brain. Because, as you know, we all have a language organ in the brain that makes us different from other mammals. And we neuroscientists can look now with the new techniques into the brain and see how things happen and where are things stored. Historically, the contribution started actually in 1896 with a nice paper from Petrus, who studied for the first time the cases of bilingual aphasia. So someone, elderly people who have a stroke, who don't anymore speak so good in their native language. And if this happens to someone who speaks two languages, Petrus saw that sometimes one language is lost while the other is still okay. And in other cases, maybe the second language is spared while the first language goes away. This is where the story started. And of course, it took 100 years of time for coming up to now. With the techniques we use, we now have imaging techniques or electrophysiological techniques with which we can look into the brain actually. And the difference is between neuroimaging and electrophysiological techniques is that one technique does look where it happens. So it has a very high spatial resolution. We can really measure brain areas. We can see the functioning of brain areas, while electrophysiological techniques, they have a perfect temporal resolution. Okay, and that explain us how and how fast different cognitive processes happen in our brain. What I do, my own line of research is by mostly employing functional and structural neuroimaging techniques in this field. So I can see with functional neuroimaging techniques what brain areas we use when we, for instance, speak one language as compared to the other language. Okay, and with this we have learned so many things, like the differences between first and second language, the differences mainly if you are high proficient, you almost activate the same brain areas as your first language. If you have a low proficiency of your second language, you activate also some other brain areas, which usually are outside the language areas. But here I have to make a very short break, because up till, I would say, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, people, most scientists, most of our colleagues would think that two languages are differently stored in our brain. Okay, and if you go back in the day, you would read, if you acquire a second language, then your first language would move from the left hemisphere, where usually language is, to the right hemisphere, because it's more for global aspects, and analytical aspects are in the left hemisphere. So the new language has to be embedded in the left hemisphere. Then you go to more recent, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, theories that maybe one language is stored more anteriorly in your left hemisphere, while the other language may be stored more posteriorly. But what functional neuroimaging has shown us in the last 20 years is none of this is true. It's actually nonsense. It's not that each language has a specific location in our brain. All languages are stored in the same language organ that we all have. Okay, even if you have 20 languages, we scanned even subjects with 25 languages, they're all in the same language areas. Okay, at least this is what we always have to keep in our mind at the macroscopical level, because with the techniques we have, we are looking at the brain macroscopy, not at the microscopical neuron cell level. But as I mentioned before, we see differences. If I'm not so much exposed to my second language, or I don't have a high proficiency in that specific language, I activate something extra in my brain. And this extra activity is usually outside of language areas. It's areas for attention, for executive functions, for memory, all those auxiliary processes that I need to support speaking in a language for which I don't have a high proficiency. Okay, and this is just to make an example. If I want to speak without errors in my second language, I have to inhibit probably my first language, so I can speak without intrusions from that language. And in order to do so, I use executive control areas, which are more anteriorly to language areas. Okay, and when we first made these studies, still people would say, but you see, a second language is differently stored because it's more anterior activity. But then you have to interpret what are these areas for, and with more refined paradigms, we have recently showed that these are really not language areas, but really for executive functions. So this is mostly the contribution of neuroscience into this field, to look how and where linguistic processes are. We cannot answer with the techniques that we have to really fine-grained linguistic theories. We cannot, and we actually would never challenge this. We stop there, but we can show it at a more simpler way how things happened. This is what I would just conclude what we can do with functional neuroimaging. And then we have another technique which is called structural neuroimaging, with which we can measure the density of gray matter and white matter, the two main components of a human brain. And we can make group comparisons. We can take a group of bilinguals, we can take a group of monolinguals and compare them. And we see that there are differences in their brain, especially for gray matter, which is where our cells are, our neurons are. And most of the differences we actually don't find in language areas, which we still find, but the most striking differences are in executive control areas. Okay, and if you think this actually makes sense, because there are some linguistic faculties, abilities that only bilinguals can do and not monolinguals. A monolingual cannot switch between languages. Okay, and in order to switch between languages, I need executive control to properly activate the language I want to speak and to inhibit the language I don't want to speak anymore. And so I need some extra linguistic function for doing this. And those are, for instance, in the anterior cingulate cortex, prefrontal cortex, in executive control areas. And there we see really nice differences in grammar density. But again, this does not happen for all bilinguals. This does happen for bilinguals who frequently use their second language. If I only have a schooling knowledge of English, okay, or of Spanish, this probably would not happen because I'm not using it. I'm not training these brain areas.
Jubin, this was, fascinating, right? Like you just did a great summary of something very complex and something that you've really been a pioneer of and for. And I'm just like fascinated here, like listening to you as how you've mastered to put all this together. And you just started like this really nice segue into our second question, which is, I think, the $1 million question that many people wonder, right? Is the bilingual brain different from the monolingual brain?
Oh, that's a very tricky question because if I open a monolingual skull and a bilingual skull, I take out the brains, okay, I wouldn't see any difference, okay? So there is no really difference like one brain looks fancier than the other, or it's bigger or is smaller. But the differences are, as I mentioned a little bit before, in structure and function with the techniques that we use. That you will find increased density in some areas for bilinguals, even white matter, gray matter, and you will find differences in functional activity. Another good point is then there are some other techniques we are using, and they show even better the differences are connectivity techniques. Like based on functional activity, I can connect brain areas and to see how the strengths of connections are. Why are we doing this? Because for each cognitive function, you don't use one brain area. You usually use a set of areas which are connected. Okay, nowadays we're talking about neural networks, and with those techniques, you can actually investigate neural networks, and we see that for some cognitive functions, those networks are stronger connected for bilinguals than compared to monolinguals. But again, I have to underline this happens for bilinguals who are really fluent and who are really exposed to their second language. What does it mean to have stronger connections? It is something which may be useful when you start aging. Okay, because we know that at a certain point of life, there's a physiological involution of our brains, i.e. called brain atrophy. It happens after 70, 75, the brain shrinks a little bit. But if you have stronger connections between areas which are shrinking, you can still use your brain as a functioning brain. So it still works and you don't see any deficit. Okay, if you don't have those strong connections, you could have some mild cognitive decline. And this is the real difference, which I would say, which is the most important finding of the last 25 years of our research, that having increased gray matter density and white matter density for certain areas, having better connections, somehow you protect your brain for when you go towards aging.
Wow, this is fantastic. I mean, and so, like I was like trying to like in my head as you were like talking, thinking about like everything that you said and how much that already contributes to like the main question that we wanted to ask you, And I'm so glad that that you're so generous with your time that you actually took the time to actually engage with us in this contextualization. So you already like touched on some points, but kind of like to come together, we now want to ask you this big question that we wanted to ask you. So Jubin, what would you say then, based on all, your experience, your knowledge, your expertise, and everything you shared with us? What would you say is unique then about the bilingual brain?
Yes, it's unique insofar as aforementioned that it is better connected, that you train your brain. We have to see bilingualism, or maybe it's better to say second language knowledge, as some experiential factor that can train our brain. And this is really not just my personal idea. This is really the outcome of many researches done all over the world, that it should be actually one of those factors, second language usage, that makes your brain stronger. I come back again to all the clinical field. We don't have any cure for cognitive decline. There's nothing. Neurologists would always tell you, train your brain, cognitive stimulation, do crosswords, Sudoku, all these cognitive stimulating things. But the most powerful of all this is speaking a second language because it trains all your brain networks. So this is, I would say, the uniqueness of the brain. And but I want to go a step back when we are little babies, okay? Because the whole story starts even there. And I have to say, not from a brain point of view, but from a cognitive viewpoint, bilingualism is not always a huge advantage. Okay, I try to avoid the word advantage to be politically correct. Bilinguals usually are slower in naming. In whatever linguistic task you can take, they may be slower than monolinguals, but we're talking about milliseconds. So something you probably would not feel in your everyday life, okay? Because bilingualism has a cost, because you have to manage two different languages. So it's more difficult than being a monolingual. Okay, usually as a monolingual, you even talk faster in your one language than not maybe the bilingual in the second language. And there's also some nice evidence, always with some exceptions, that usually the lexicon of monolingual is huger than singularly taken each lexicon of a bilingual. Okay, so that's also a cost. Okay, but do we actually feel this cost in everyday life? I would say no. But having to handle two lexicons, okay, that actually makes your brain smarter. Okay, because you have to train them always. You have to access one. You have to translate, which a monolingual has never to do. So it is a lot of cognitive work, and so it's like you have to. Each physiology professor always tells you never say a brain is like a muscle. Okay, but I'm trying to explain still using an example of a muscle. The more you train a muscle, the more stronger it becomes. Okay, so the more you train your brain, the more stronger your brain will become. And second language knowledge and usage is actually a sort of very efficient brain training. So I would say this is really the uniqueness of a bilingual brain, that it becomes so powerful.
Thank you, Jubin, so much for all of this, for your generosity, for your time, for your inspiring and groundbreaking work, and for your very insightful answers, and ultimately for helping us better understand the cognitive neuroscience of bilingualism and the uniqueness of the bilingual brain. It was really an absolute pleasure to have you as our fourth guest, and I really want to thank you from the bottom of your heart, from everything, for your time and for everything you've done so far with
Thank
your
you,
work.
Alicia. It was a pleasure, and thank you really so much for having involved me.
Thank
And
you.
congrats for this beautiful series you're doing.
Take care. It means a lot to us. Ciao. We really hope you enjoyed our fourth helping question, and that Jubin's fascinating scientific insight and professional experience helps you to better understand what is unique about the bilingual brain. Stay tuned for our fifth episode coming to you on May 15th, where we'll get to ask Professor Ellen Bialystok, Distinguished Research Professor of Psychology and Walter Gordon Research Chair of Lifespan Cognitive Development at York University in Canada, our fifth helping question. In what ways can bilingualism impact healthy and pathological aging? We look forward to seeing you all back here on May 15th. Also, do not forget to subscribe and to share with us your thoughts, feedback, and comments on any of our social media channels. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you all back here on May 15th. Bye!